The gavel fell with a finality that shattered Leo Thompson's world. In that instant, the bankrupt architect wasn't just losing his late father's cherished house. He was unknowingly opening the door to the man who would claim his heart as well. Leo stood frozen in the back of the Oak Park courthouse auction room, the crisp Chicago air seeping through the cracked window like a reminder that nothing stayed warm forever. At 35, he had built a name for himself designing sleek downtown lofts and sustainable community centers. But one bad investment partnership and a string of client pullouts later, his firm lay in ruins. The Victorian house on Oak Street, Dad's pride, the place where Leo had first sketched floor plans at the kitchen table, now belonged to the highest bidder. His mother had called that morning, voice tight with the same quiet disappointment she'd carried since Dad's heart attack 2 years ago. The house was his legacy, Leo. How could you let it go? He hadn't answered, because the truth was he had no choice. Creditors circled like vultures, and the equity in the property was the only way out. Leo shoved his hands into the pockets of his worn wool coat and slipped out before anyone could offer condolences. The walk home through familiar tree-lined streets felt endless. Neighbors waved, unaware that the Thompson family home was no longer theirs. By the time he reached the front porch, the for sale sign already looked weathered, though it had only been up a week. Leo unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside, the scent of lemon polish and old books hitting him like a memory he couldn't outrun. His father's study still held the drafting table where Leo had learned to measure twice and cut once. He ran a finger along the edge, dust gathering under his nail. "Sorry, Dad," he whispered to the empty room. The silence answered back, heavy with everything unsaid between them. Leo's carefully guarded truth about who he really loved, the late-night arguments that never quite surfaced, the way Dad had always assumed his son would marry a nice girl and fill the house with grandchildren. The doorbell rang sharp and unexpected. Leo wiped his eyes quickly and opened the door to find a tall man in a tailored navy coat standing on the steps, dark hair neatly styled, eyes the color of storm clouds over Lake Michigan. "Leo Thompson? Xavier Reed. I'm here for the private viewing. My realtor said you might be available." Xavier's handshake was firm, warm, the kind that lingered a second longer than professional. Leo felt something shift in his chest, a flicker he immediately shoved down. This was business. Nothing more. They toured the house in silence at first, Xavier's gaze sweeping over the crown molding, the wide staircase, the sunroom where Leo's mother had once hosted bridge club. "Beautiful bones," Xavier said finally, voice low and appreciative. "I can see why it's special." Leo nodded, explaining the original 1890s details. His father had restored himself. As they moved through the rooms, Xavier asked questions that went beyond square footage, about light patterns in the mornings, about the family stories behind the built-in bookshelves. Leo found himself answering more openly than he'd intended, the words tumbling out like he'd been waiting for someone who actually wanted to listen. By the time they reached the backyard garden, the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. Xavier stopped beside the old oak tree where Leo had carved his initials at 12. "I'm not flipping this place," he said quietly, turning to face Leo. "I want to live here, restore it properly, make it feel like home again." Their eyes met, and for a split second Leo saw something in Xavier's expression that wasn't just about real estate. It scared him. He cleared his throat. "The closing's in 2 weeks. If your offer stands." Xavier smiled, small and knowing. "It stands. And Leo, if you ever want to talk about the house, or anything else, I'm around." Leo watched him leave, heart hammering against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with the auction. He locked the door behind him and leaned against it, breath shaky. The house was gone. But the way Xavier had looked at him lingered like an unanswered question he wasn't ready to face. Leo spent the next 10 days packing boxes in a haze of denial. Each taped cardboard flap felt like sealing away another piece of his past. His best friend Mark stopped by on Saturday with coffee and a six-pack, the same ritual they'd shared since college. "You look like hell, man," Mark said, dropping onto the worn leather couch in the living room. "This isn't just about the house. Talk to me." Leo hesitated, then told him everything. The bankruptcy details, the crushing debt, the way Mom's calls grew shorter each day. He left out the part about Xavier's lingering glance, because naming it would make it real. Mark listened, nodding. You're allowed to rebuild, Leo. Dad would want that. The closing happened on a crisp Tuesday morning at a downtown title company. Leo signed the papers with a steady hand that betrayed nothing of the storm inside. Xavier sat across the table in a crisp white shirt, signing with the same quiet confidence he'd shown during the viewing. When it was done, Xavier slid a business card across the polished wood. I meant what I said. I could use an architect's eye on the renovations. No pressure. Leo took the card, fingers brushing Xavier's briefly. The contact sent an unwelcome spark up his arm. I'll think about it, he muttered, pocketing it quickly. 2 days later, Leo's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The house feels empty without its stories. Coffee tomorrow? Xavier. Leo stared at the screen for 10 minutes before replying with a single word. Sure. They met at a small cafe near the Riverwalk, the kind of place with exposed brick and too many plants. Xavier was already there, 2 lattes waiting. Conversation flowed easier than Leo expected. Architecture magazines, favorite Chicago buildings, the way the city changed seasons. Xavier shared that he'd moved from Seattle after selling his tech startup, looking for roots. I grew up bouncing between foster homes, he said softly. Never had a place that felt permanent. This house, it spoke to me. Leo found himself opening up about his father's expectations, the pressure to be the perfect son, the dreams he'd shelved to keep the family business afloat. Xavier listened without judgment, blue eyes steady. Sounds like you carried a lot alone, he said. When they parted, Xavier touched Leo's shoulder lightly. Call me if you want to walk the property again. Keys are yours anytime. Leo walked home through Millennium Park, the city lights blurring as conflicting emotions swirled. Part of him wanted to run. Another part, the part he'd buried for years, wanted to see what happened if he stayed. The next week Xavier hired him as consultant. Leo arrived at the house on a Saturday morning with his old drafting tools, expecting awkwardness. Instead, Xavier greeted him with fresh bagels and genuine excitement. They spent hours measuring, sketching ideas for opening the kitchen to the garden. Laughter came unexpectedly when Leo teased Xavier about his terrible sense of color. By afternoon, they sat on the back steps sharing stories of past heartbreaks. Leo's college boyfriend who had moved to New York without warning, Xavier's ex who couldn't handle his ambition. Neither mentioned the current spark between them, but it hummed beneath every word. That evening, Leo's mother called again. I drove by the house today. Saw lights on. Is the new owner nice? Leo swallowed hard. Yeah, Mom. He seems decent. The lie tasted bitter because decent didn't begin to cover the way Xavier made him feel seen for the first time in years. As he hung up, Leo stared at the business card still on his kitchen counter. The house was sold, but the door to something new had just cracked open, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to walk through, or the courage to close it forever. The renovation plans took shape over the following month. Late-night sessions at the house turning into something neither man named. Leo would arrive after his part-time consulting gigs downtown, sleeves rolled up, ready to argue over load-bearing walls. Xavier always had music playing, soft jazz that filled the empty rooms, and coffee strong enough to keep them talking past midnight. One Thursday, after debating the perfect shade of gray for the study, Xavier pulled out an old photo album he'd found in the attic. Your dad kept everything, he said, handing it over. Leo flipped through pages of family vacations, his younger self grinning beside his father at construction sites. A lump formed in his throat. He never knew the real me, Leo admitted quietly. Xavier didn't push, just sat closer on the floor, shoulder brushing Leo's. Maybe he suspected more than you think. Parents usually do. The conversation lingered in Leo's mind as he drove home that night. For the first time, he wondered if his father's silence had been fear rather than rejection. The next weekend, Xavier invited him to a small housewarming. Nothing fancy, just a few neighbors and Mark. Leo showed up with a bottle of wine, heart racing at the sight of Xavier in a simple button-down that made his broad shoulders look even stronger. The evening passed in easy laughter until one guest, an older woman from down the block, asked innocently, "So Leo, when are you bringing a nice girl around to see the place?" The room quieted. Leo froze. Xavier stepped in smoothly. "Leo's helping me bring the house back to life. That's plenty for now." Later, alone in the kitchen, Xavier murmured, "You don't owe anyone explanations." Leo met his eyes, the air thick with everything unsaid. "I've spent my whole life giving them anyway." Their first real disagreement came 2 weeks later. Xavier wanted to modernize the front porch. Leo insisted on preserving every original detail. Voices rose in the living room until Xavier finally said, "This isn't just my house anymore, Leo. It's ours in a way. Your history lives here." The words hung between them. Leo left early that night, driving aimlessly along Lakeshore Drive, windows down, wind whipping away the tears he refused to acknowledge. He called Mark at midnight. "I think I'm falling for him," he confessed. Mark didn't laugh. "Then stop running, man. You deserve this." The following Tuesday, Leo returned with revised drawings that honored both visions. Xavier opened the door, relief plain on his face. They worked side by side in silence for hours before Xavier spoke. "I don't want to push you, but I see you, Leo. All of you." Leo set down his pencil, pulse thundering. "I've never let anyone see everything." Xavier reached across the table, fingers brushing Leo's. Neither pulled away. That small touch felt like the first honest breath Leo had taken in years. Outside, autumn leaves swirled against the windows, but inside the house, something warmer took root. Fragile, terrifying, and undeniably real. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Oak Park in snow that muffled the city's usual noise. Leo and Xavier fell into a rhythm of shared dinners and late-night planning sessions that blurred every boundary. One Friday, Xavier surprised Leo with tickets to an architecture exhibit downtown. They walked the galleries shoulder to shoulder, discussing light and space like old friends. On the train ride back, Xavier's hand rested lightly on Leo's knee. Neither spoke, but the contact said enough. Leo's mother noticed the change during her surprise visit the next weekend. "You seem lighter," she said over tea in the kitchen she no longer owned. When Xavier joined them, polite and charming, she studied him carefully. "The house looks wonderful. You two make a good team." The comment landed like a stone in still water. Leo changed the subject quickly, but the tension followed him home. The crack appeared when Leo's former business partner, Derek, showed up unannounced at the house one snowy evening. Derek had been the reason the firm collapsed. Risky loans Leo had trusted too blindly. Now he stood on the porch with excuses and a request for money. Xavier answered the door, protective instinct flaring. Voices carried to the kitchen where Leo froze. "He's using you," Derek sneered loud enough for Leo to hear. "Just like he used me. Pretty house, pretty architect. Same game." Leo stepped into the hall, face burning. "Get out." After Derek left, Xavier turned, eyes searching. "Is that what you think this is? A game?" Leo's old fears rushed back. The years of hiding, the belief that love always came with strings. "Maybe it started that way for you," he said, voice cracking. "The house first, then me." Xavier's face fell. "Leo, I bought the house because it felt like home. I stayed because of you." The argument escalated, years of Leo's buried shame pouring out. He accused Xavier of pity, of wanting to fix the broken architect like another renovation project. Xavier listened, then quietly asked him to leave for the night. Leo drove through the blizzard, tears freezing on his cheeks. For 2 weeks they didn't speak. Leo threw himself into freelance work, sleeping on Mark's couch, replaying every moment. His mother called daily, sensing something wrong. "Whatever it is, don't let pride steal your happiness." she said one night. Your father regretted his silences. Don't repeat them. The words cracked something open inside Leo. He realized the real betrayal wasn't Xavier's. It was his own fear refusing to trust. On Christmas Eve, Leo stood outside the house holding a small wrapped gift. Snow fell softly as he rang the bell. Xavier opened the door, eyes guarded but hopeful. I was wrong, Leo said simply. The house was never just walls. And you were never just the buyer. Xavier pulled him inside, the warmth of the fireplace wrapping around them like forgiveness. They talked until dawn, laying every card on the table. Leo's lifelong struggle with identity, Xavier's fear of abandonment, the way both had built walls to survive. When Leo finally leaned in, the kiss was soft, tentative, the first honest touch after months of dancing around truth. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, the house, and Leo's heart, finally began to heal. Spring brought new life to the garden and to the careful relationship growing between them. Leo moved some clothes into the house, not officially but enough that his toothbrush lived in the master bath. Mornings found them sharing coffee on the restored porch, talking about everything and nothing. Xavier started introducing Leo to his circle, tech friends, neighbors who accepted them without question. For the first time, Leo felt the weight of secrecy lift. Yet old habits died hard. When his sister visited from California, Leo introduced Xavier only as the owner, until she cornered him in the hallway. I see how you look at him, little brother. Dad would have come around eventually. Stop punishing yourself. Her words echoed long after she left. The real test came in May. Leo received an offer to lead a major civic project downtown, the kind that could rebuild his career. The catch: it required traveling 6 months a year. He agonized for days, pacing the sunroom while Xavier watched quietly. Take it, Xavier finally said one evening over dinner. I won't be the reason you shrink your dreams. Leo heard the pain beneath the generosity. And what about us? Xavier's smile was sad. We'll figure it out. But I refuse to clip your wings. That night they lay awake, hands linked, fear and love tangled together. Leo realized the offer wasn't just about work. It was another chance to run from vulnerability. 2 weeks later, standing in the same garden where they'd first connected, Leo turned down the project. I want to build something here, he told Xavier, voice steady for the first time in years. With you. No more running. Xavier pulled him close, the embrace fierce and grateful. They spent the summer restoring the attic into a shared studio, Leo's drafting table beside Xavier's laptop. Family dinners became regular, Leo's mother learning to bake for two, Mark bringing his wife over for barbecues. The community that once felt judgmental now wrapped around them like the old oak tree's branches. Leo still carried scars, moments when doubt crept in at 3 a.m., but Xavier's steady presence reminded him every day that love wasn't a transaction. It was a choice renewed each morning. One humid August evening, they sat on the porch swing watching fireflies dance. Xavier turned to him. This house saved us both, didn't it? Leo nodded, throat tight. You saved me. The words carried every unspoken fear he'd finally released. As stars appeared overhead, Leo understood that the bankruptcy, the auction, the loss, they had all been the unlikely path to the life he was always meant to live. Fall painted the neighborhood in fiery reds and golds, mirroring the warmth that now filled every corner of the house. Leo and Xavier hosted their first Thanksgiving together, tables extended to welcome both families and chosen friends. Laughter echoed where silence had once reigned. Leo's mother hugged Xavier tightly before leaving, whispering something that made him smile softly. Later, alone by the fireplace, Xavier pulled Leo down beside him. I never planned on falling in love when I bought this place, he admitted. Leo traced the line of Xavier's jaw, heart full. I never planned on letting anyone in. But here we are. They talked late into the night about the future, maybe adopting, maybe expanding the studio, definitely growing old in this house that had witnessed their beginning. Leo still worked as an architect, but now on his own terms, smaller projects that fed his soul rather than his ego. Xavier's tech investments allowed them the freedom to travel when they wanted, always returning to the Victorian that felt like an extension of themselves. The misunderstandings and heartbreaks of the past year had forged something unbreakable. Leo no longer hid. At neighborhood block parties, he held Xavier's hand openly. The weight of years of secrecy finally lifted. His father's old study became their favorite room, filled with new memories alongside the old. On the anniversary of the auction, they stood together on the front porch watching the same oak tree drop its leaves. Leo turned to Xavier. "I used to think losing this house would break me. Instead, it gave me everything." Xavier kissed him softly, the kind of kiss that promised forever without words. As they walked inside, hand in hand, Leo realized the journey hadn't been about saving the house. It had been about saving himself. True or false? Sometimes the greatest loss opens the door to the love you never knew you needed.